I've asked you to read the Introduction to Art History that is on the website. And so you've read about the background to art history, what is art, how does art history differ from other approaches to art. And now I want to talk to you about basic terminology. I want to go over some of that material that we'll be using over and over again in the course. And three basic terms that we're going to be using are medium, style, and iconography. And one might say that every work of art, or almost every work of art, consists of these three basic components. Now, the one where there might be some question would be, some people would say that works of art that are non-representational, that have no subject matter from the visible world, from literature, from history, from religion, they might say that those have no subject matter and hence no iconography. On the other hand, some people would say, yes, they do have subject matter. It's not just from the material world around us. It's not representational. We'll leave that aside and discuss these three basic terms. The first one I'm going to talk about is medium. Now, you could have for the plural the media, which would be the normal way that you would take a work that is in a Latin root and make it a plural. As you say, medium, media becomes the plural. Or, anglicizing as it were, mediums. And some people prefer today mediums because the word media has such a broad range of we talk such a broad range of meanings. We talk about digital media or print media, things that are maybe a little bit different than traditional art. I don't care, whichever one you use. Medium is the physical materials from which the work of art is made, and it also implies the techniques used to make it. Now, sometimes we actually use the technique as the name of the medium. So, particularly in printmaking, for example, engraving or etching or lithograph. That is talking about the way in which the print is made. The final print is usually ink on paper, but that could also be drawing or different types of printmaking. So in that case, they'll say, it's an engraving, it's an etching. Other works of art, we talk about the medium describing the materials. We'll say that something is made out of marble or bronze, or it is oil paint on canvas, or oil paint on panel. That's a wooden panel. It's on pieces of wood. Or with painting, you might have acrylics or watercolors or tempera paint, or sometimes you have fresco, which is painting on wet plaster on walls or ceilings. There's all sorts of different types of material that is used to create the work of art, and that is the medium. Now, a lot of times when we say the medium, it may imply the technique. For example, if I say, it's a marble statue, well, you know that they didn't take the marble and squeeze it into shape or melt it and pour it into a mold. You know that marble is a stone, and so tools were used, hammers, chisels, rasps, and they cut away the material that will not be the finished work of art. Just saying marble, we have some idea of what techniques are used to create that work. The second term that I wanted to talk to you about is iconography. Now, the word literally means, icon means image. graphy means writing. For example, you know that biography is writing about a life. Well, iconography is not just writing about images. Iconography is taking on a specific meaning within art history, and it refers to the subject matter of the work of art. Now, that includes any story, or if there is any symbolism that's involved. And it's become an entire branch of iconography. I have to tell people I'm an iconographer. I study the subject matter of the works of art, how the subject is expressed through style, for example, and also how the subject matter relates to various things in the historical period. For example, religious subjects relating to different theological, devotional, or liturgical aspects. Or could relate to something politically that's going on. There's a lot of different ways to talk about subject matter. Now, when you look at your book, you'll usually see a title written. You'll have the name of the artist, if it's known, and then the title. And the title is usually identifying the basic subject. In fact, there's a lot of works of art that don't have what we might call a real absolute title. What we would call a title is simply the subject matter. So if we say, and here's an example from religious art, if we say it's the crucifixion, most people aren't going to say, well, who's being crucified? Or why? Because that is a subject from Christian art, and it implies that that's the crucifixion of Christ. You could have, I suppose, a painting of the crucifixion of Spartacus, but then it would be identified as that. Or if I say this is a painting or a statue of Hercules. Now, Hercules is a figure from Greek or Roman mythology. And so if I say Hercules, it implies, that this is a mythological subject. Now, there's a lot more than just identifying the basic subject. In those cases, it's often assumed that people know the story behind it. Because, for example, in Western culture, most people probably would know something about those subjects, even if they were not, of the Christian religion, or maybe they hadn't really studied mythology. They'd probably heard of Hercules. But you can go much more deeply into the subject matter of a work of art. And you can see how subject matter, you have the same work of art, the same subject is portrayed by different artists, is portrayed throughout history, in different eras, and how the meaning of it may change. Or sometimes there's symbolism. Well, let me give you one example. Briefly, you see a picture sometimes of a woman holding a baby. And perhaps there's rays of light coming from their heads, or gold discs behind them, or something else that says to you, this isn't just any woman and her baby. This is a work of Christian art, and it represents the Virgin and Child, or the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus. Or, as we often do, is use the Italian Madonna, My Lady. And I would say Madonna and Child, or Virgin and Child, or the Virgin Mary and the Christ Child. All of those are the same subject. So if we have a work of art that, it's called the Madonna and Child in your book, and I call it the Virgin and Child, it's the same subject. Specific titles are given when they start having art exhibits, and they have to have little placards. So somewhere in the 18th century, the artist may be naming the work of art. But before then, it's just whatever the subject is. So we've got this picture of the Virgin and Child. Now, there's a lot of different ways to show that. And some of them have symbolism. Sometimes you'll see Mary seated on the ground or on a very low bench or footrest or something like this. And then we're saying she's the Madonna of humility. And sometimes you'll see her enthroned, wearing a crown or with angels holding a crown above her head. And that is representing Mary as the Queen of Heaven, because in Christian belief, she is the mother of Jesus, whom they believe to be the Son of God. And he is, by definition, the King of Heaven. So the mother of the king is the queen. We'd say the dowager queen, or the queen mum, perhaps, if you're English. And there is I was going to say infinite. There are large numbers of symbols that are associated with Mary. She's been given many titles from the Bible, from scholarly exegesis of Christians, for example, in the Middle Ages. In fact, there is one book that lists thousands of titles of Mary. So she is the Aracole, the altar of heaven, for example. She's identified with she's identified with the church. So when we come across these things in works of art, we'll talk about them. I'm not asking you to memorize every meaning of every work that ever existed, but when we talk about them in class, we'll identify these and discuss them. And sometimes they're controversial. Sometimes people say, yes, this. Some people say this is a symbol, and someone will say, no, it isn't. And they may even disagree about what it means. So that's scholarship. Style. Define style as the distinctive manner in which the artist uses the visual elements. Now, that may sound a little vague, so let's get a little more specific. What are these visual or stylistic elements? Now, almost every introductory book on art or art history will list visual elements. And some of them have quite a long list. I've seen a book with 14 visual elements. I also used to have to teach from a book that had 5 visual elements. And I didn't actually like that book very well, but I did like the outline of it. And I liked the fact that it condensed the visual elements. So I'm going to use those. And for example, the word color. Some books will divide that up into color, light, and shadow. You'll get 3 out of that. In this case, they're going to combine them under that one heading, color. And things like volume, well, that involves both shape and space. So we can accommodate it within this short list, as it were, of visual elements. Now, we said that was the distinctive way in which the artist uses the visual elements. And we often say, that every artist has his own style. Now, some artists imitate others, sometimes more closely. Sometimes there's simply some influence there. But artists have their own distinctive style, just as each one of you has your own distinctive handwriting. And it may resemble someone else's, but a handwriting expert will be able to distinguish the styles of handwriting. And sometimes you're influenced. When you first learned to write, you were taught to write probably in elementary school, and you had to copy letters, and you would write like that. And then as time went by, you changed the way you would make some letters. when I was in elementary school, the girls used to put little flowers or hearts or something like that as their dot over their eye. And so, we influenced each other. One time I saw a picture of an old map, and I liked the way they made the G's. I thought it was very attractive, and I started doing that. I was influenced by that, for example. So, we are influenced by other people, and we may change our style because we change. My handwriting today is totally different than it was 40 years ago. And certainly much different than it was 50 years ago. So you could think of this as the handwriting of the artist. However, it's not just the handwriting of the artist. We also talk about the style of a particular historical period, that during one particular period of time, artists very often used the visual elements in certain ways. For example, 15th century in the Netherlands, and then in work that was influenced by that in Northern Europe, artists try to show a great deal of specific detail. What is the texture of the cloth? Can I show objects with light reflecting off of them? So that's characteristic of that period. During the 17th century, in Europe, artists very frequently use a lot of diagonal movement within the work of art. And that's another characteristic of that period. So we can sometimes talk about period styles. Now, they're not absolutes. There are exceptions, as you'll find out, but something that's very frequently done. Let me give you one from architecture. The pointed arch we associate with what we call Gothic art. It has nothing to do with the Goths, but that's what we call it today. And it starts about 1140 and extends, throughout Europe, in some places, lasting into the 16th century, for example, in England. But that pointed arch is considered a characteristic of Gothic art. Actually, it was actually used earlier in Burgundian art. But it was taken over and used with other visual elements and becomes a characteristic, if you will, of the Gothic style, in the late 12th or mid-12th through the 13th, 14th, in Northern Europe, 15th and 16th century. We also talk about regional styles. I just said something about in 15th century Netherlandish art in the lowlands, in what today would be Belgium and the Netherlands. And so I was combining temporal, 15th century, with a region, the lowlands, the Netherlands, and this is including what is today called Belgium. It's not just the Kingdom of the Netherlands, which we'll explain shortly. So we sometimes talk about regional styles. For example, 16th century Italian art. In most of Italy, the painting is what we call linear. It has very clear edges, sometimes even lines around them. But in Venice, in the 16th century, artists start to paint with loose brushwork, starting with Titian and continuing on. And even artists like Giorgione paint with soft edges, even very early in the 16th century. And then it becomes freer and freer, so you can even see the brushwork in the second half of the 16th century. So that becomes both a temporal and a regional characteristic that then is carried on into other times and other places. Okay, what I want to do is talk about the visual elements, go into more detail, and show you, some things about these and how the style will influence the impact on the artist. The first of these is color. And I'm including both light and shade within this larger heading of color. Now, color probably is the visual element that has the most immediate impact on the viewer. And it often has very strong emotional associations. For example, if you go into a room and it is red, you're going to have a strong reaction to that. You may like it, you may find it overwhelming, but it will react on you emotionally. And we even have within our language phrases that suggest these emotional impacts, some emotional associations. For example, we say, I see red, or I feel blue, or jealousy is a green-eyed monster. Now that last is a phrase from Othello. And I often think, what shade of green was Shakespeare talking about? Because I don't think of that as an emerald green, although envy is associated with the color green. I kind of think of some kind of bilious green, maybe with some dark tones in it, that's I got some yellows and darker hues, maybe some green that's not a pure green, or that doesn't look like new leaves on a tree. It has a very different emotional association, being associated with one of the 7 deadly sins, envy or jealousy. And of course, green also has other symbolic meanings. It is associated with fertility, for example. So it has some very positive associations. You think of beautiful leaves on the trees or beautiful green grass. So colors, even when they are symbolic of something or have a certain emotional association, often it's the shade of the color, or the quantity, or the way it's used with the other things. So we've established that color has an emotional association. We divide colors into 2 groups, warm and cool. Now, this isn't exactly the temperature. For example, if you have a gas furnace, you want it to burn blue. You don't want it to burn red or yellow, because actually the blue flame may be hotter. We're talking about, I guess you could say, a psychological impact of color. So the warm hues are red, yellow, orange, and mixtures of those where those dominate. So, for example, you could have a warm brown that's maybe primarily a reddish brown or a golden brown, and that would be warm. You also have cool colors. Cool colors are blues, greens, violets, and you could think about, sitting by a blue lake with green grass under the shade of a tree with green leaves and violet shadows, all very relaxing. Your warm hues might, be very stimulating. Hot, fiery, like fire or the sun. And so when we say stimulating, a warm hue can be stimulating in you might say, a good way or a bad way. You ask people, what do you think is the happiest color? And they'll usually answer one of the warm hues, very frequently yellow, sometimes red or orange. On the other hand, you have, so much red, for example, or so much orange. It just makes you nervous. And of course, different people have different tolerances for different hues, but generally it's going to be stimulating to have all that red or orange or yellow. Cool hues, very relaxing. There's a reason that they used to paint walls of schools and institutions of various kind green, because it was supposed to be relaxing and calming. And some of you will have a favorite color, and it may be from either of these groups because of the way it makes you feel. Also, colors can either appear to advance or appear to recede. In other words, they have an illusion of space. So if you were to have, let's say, a white canvas or a gray background, and you put, say, a circle of red on it and a circle of blue, the red or the yellow or the orange might seem to pop out at you, and the blue might seem to go back, or the green or the violet. Now, as you'll find out, you can change this somewhat. So that's another aspect that we want to talk about. We could also talk about 3 different terms that refer to color. You can call these 3 different parts of color, or referring to 3 different aspects of color. Now, the first one is hue. And as you can see, I didn't put a definition on the PowerPoint because the definition is one of those definitions that doesn't really tell you much. But the definition of hue is the property that distinguishes one color from another. The property which distinguishes one color from another. Oh, what? What's that mean? Well, it's easier to give an example. When we say color, we usually think of the hue. Everything I've been talking about with color, I've been naming red and yellow and blue and violet. Those are hues. So the hue is what we might call the name of the color. And as you can see, you could have a light red and a dark red, or a pure red, or a red that's mixed with other things. And yet, what is that property that distinguishes it from the lightness or the purity? It's the redness. So light red, light blue, 2 different hues. So that property is you might call it the color name. That might even be an easier way to think of it. Okay, then we have value. Now, we're not talking about money here. How much is that work of art worth? We're not going to talk about that at all. Value, in terms of color, refers to the lightness or the darkness. Now, some hues are in and of themselves lighter or darker. Yellow seems to be lighter than violet. But you can also change the lightness and darkness of a hue or of a color. If you are working with paint or ink or something like that, you mix, say, white in, and that makes your color lighter. And sometimes we give them extra names. You mix white with red, and you call it rose or pink or something like that. But essentially, pink is light red. And then you mix a black hue in with it. You make it darker. You have a dark red. You might call it wine red or burgundy or something like that. But it's red. It's a dark red. Saturation refers to the intensity or the purity of the color. Now, some books will say it's the brightness or the dullness, but those terms also refer to the texture. You think something that's very highly polished as bright, and something that's very matte, and not polished as dull. So I'm not going to use those to refer to saturation. I'm going to use purity and intensity. We're not working with light, so every time you're using a pigment, such as in paint, there will be some impurities. If you mix black with yellow, you're going to get something that has some green in it because they make the black with blue pigments. But if you can think of the most pure, the most intense of these different hues. Blue, it's usually what we call ultramarine blue, and literally was made from lapis lazuli originally. Now, of course, synthetically made. That would be your most intense, completely saturated blue. So it's the most pure blue. Or what we might call fire engine red. That would be your intense, bright red. And you say we're using that word bright there, not meaning polish here, but meaning intensity or purity. But if you mix it with something, it would become less saturated. So if you mix it with white, now you're making it both higher in value because it's lighter, but lower in saturation because it's less pure, less intense. Or you could mix it with black, or you could mix it with another color. So there's all sorts of ways of changing that saturation. Artists have a diagram that shows color relationships, and that's called the color wheel. And as you can see, there are different hues that are shown, kind of a wedge-shaped form, forming a ring or a wheel. In the center, you have gray. We'll explain why. And you can also see that some of these hues have numbers next to them. You have yellow, blue, and red. All have a 1. These are what we call primary colors. And let's say you're a poor artist and you can't afford to buy, dozens of tubes of paint today. You would probably buy just a few. And among those would be a yellow, say cadmium yellow, blue, maybe an ultramarine blue, red, probably once again a cadmium red. And then you'd probably buy yourself some white and some black. And with those, at least in theory, you can make any hue. Actually, as you learn what your palette is, you'll probably pick up a few other hues that you want to use. But yeah, you can keep it fairly simple because from those 3 hues, yellow, blue, red, you can create almost any other hue. But there's no way you can take other hues and put them together and make yellow or blue or red. Those are the primary ones. Those are number 1. You have to have those to make the other ones. Okay, then you can see 2s next to some of them. Now, if you mix 1 part yellow and 1 part red, you make orange. So it's a secondary color. 1 part yellow, 1 part blue, green. With 1 part blue and 1 part red, you make violet. And then, of course, you can make colors between those. So if you took 2 parts yellow and 1 part blue, you'd make yellow-green. Or 2 parts blue and 1 part red would be blue-violet. Now, you could go on to this infinitely, making it smaller and smaller bits. It doesn't have to be done mathematically. Most people mix to sight. But it gives you an idea of what these color relationships can be and how you can use them. When hues are adjacent on the color wheel and they're next to each other and they're sharing some hue, we call these analogous, and they're harmonious because they are sharing a hue. For example, yellow. Everything on this wheel from red-orange, which has just a little bit of yellow in it, to yellow-green, which has, 1 part yellow and 2 parts blue, all share yellow. So those would be harmonious, analogous. And of course, the closer it is, like yellow-orange, yellow-green, those would be very, very close to yellow. So those would be the most analogous hues. On the other hand, if you take hues that are opposite on the color wheel, let's say blue and orange, those are the most opposite colors. If you put two fully saturated hues together that are opposite or complementary, say orange and blue, they set up a tension. You could say they fight with each other. Now, there's ways to get over that, and we will be talking about that very late in the course, actually. There is an artist who uses near complements, and what he does is he makes them less saturated so that they do have a kind of harmony that they can get together. Now, how's that possible? Well, look at the color wheel. There's something in the middle. There's gray. Now, you probably all know that you could take white paint and black paint and mix it together and get gray. And you could, more white, you'd have lighter grays, and more black, you'd have darker grays. But there's another way to make gray, and that is to mix two complements. So if you were to mix yellow and violet, or blue and orange, or red and green, in equal amounts, you would get a very equal gray. Now, what if you mix them in unequal amounts? Essentially, you're graying down the hue. So if you have blue and you add a little orange to it, you're making it less saturated, a little more gray. And the more you put in it, the closer it comes to, gray. But it also means that you could have grays that are warm and cool. And also, uneven mixtures of the complements can make a brown, and different kinds of browns, obviously, too. So browns and grays, which we sometimes think of as neutrals, can actually be warm or cool depending on how they're mixed. Let me give you an example of complementary hues. Now, notice that this is complementary with an E, not complementary with the I. It's not giving somebody a compliment, not saying something nice about them. They complement each other. In other words, they fit together. They're opposites that work together. You think of something like yin and yang. They fit together as a whole, but they're very different. So here we have our example, and I'm using red and green. And this is a painting by Vincent van Gogh from the late 19th century. And it's known as the Night Cafe. And you'll notice that the wall is this, very saturated red, and the ceiling is a very saturated green. And then throughout the room, there are different shades of green. I call a bilious green on the billiard table. That seems to be a pun there. But at any rate, you have this contrast of red and green, which are complements. Some of them fully saturated, some of them mixed with something else that's warm and hot, yellows. And it sets up a tension. It makes you nervous. And then he has this very dominant yellow, gold, sort of yellow-orange, I guess, color that is very hot, just as the red is very hot. And once again, there's this unease about the color scheme here. Well, Van Gogh wanted to do that. He writes about this, and when we say cafe in our country, we usually think of a place where you go to buy coffee. But a cafe in France in the late 19th century would also be a place where you'd go to buy alcoholic beverages. We'd probably say a bar. And some of them were very harmful. For example, many people became addicted to absinthe, which literally, if you drink enough of it, is poisonous. And so he described what he wanted to do with this cafe that stayed up all night, and people could drink till they were insensible. He said, I wanted to create the mood of a place where anything could happen, where a murder could be committed. And rather than, making dark shadows or something like that, he sets it up with the tension and the colors, which really almost seem to fight with each other. And as I say, make you feel very uneasy. They're very stimulating. all of these warm hues and then the complements, which seem to fight with each other. Okay. Now, we also want to talk about, we talked about hue, we want to talk about the value or the lightness or darkness of a color. And we said that warm hues seem to, or warm colors, warm hues seem to advance. And cool hues, or cool colors, seem to recede. In other words, they appear as though they have a different spatial placement, even though it's an illusion. But it's also true of value. Light colors appear to advance. Dark colors appear to recede. So this is one way you can manipulate space in a painting. If you want something to seem to come forward, you can make it lighter. And if you want it to appear, receding, going backwards, going further in depth, you could make it darker. I'll show you an example in a moment. Another term that I want to give you, and we will be using this one, is chiaro scuro. Chiaro scuro. You can see, divide the word into sort of two parts. Chiaro scuro. It means literally in Italian, light, chiaro, scuro, dark. Now, one way to remember that is chiaro. It kind of looks like our word for clear. There's not a real root there. But, that's light. And scuro has a root that we're very familiar with, actually. The word obscure, which means it's dark. The obscure side of the moon is the dark side of the moon. And they both come from the same Latin root. So scuro is dark. Now, how do we use this in art? It's not just any time you use light and dark, which is, obviously pretty much all the time. But it refers to modeling or shading in light and dark to make an image appear solid. And pretty much most artists who are trying to create a illusionistic image will be using chiaroscuro. So here's an example. You've probably seen reproductions of this. It's an 18th century portrait of a young aristocrat, and we know it as The Blue Boy by Thomas Gainsborough. Now, as you can see, he looks like he's three-dimensional. You can see one leg is darker. He's using darker hues, and the other leg he's using lighter hues, and the lighter leg appears to advance. It appears as though it's coming forward. The same thing. It looks like his torso. It's lightest in the front, and then as we go to the side, it's shaded in shadow. And that it makes it appear as though his torso is actually three-dimensional, it's actually solid. So it gives the illusion of a solid, three-dimensional figure standing in a space. Well, there's something you don't know about this painting. You've probably seen it, and you thought, oh, this little boy in, a sissy costume or something. Actually, of course, this is the way that a well-dressed, aristocratic young man would dress. There's nothing sissy about it in its time. But there's something else you don't know about it. This painting is an in-your-face, don't tell me how to paint kind of painting. That's why Gainsborough painted it. At this time, they had set up a Royal Academy in England. And the Royal Academy established rules about painting. And Gainsborough felt that he didn't want to follow the rules all the time. And he wanted to show people that you could break the rules. And so he painted this painting. Now, what was the rule? The rule was that blues are cool colors. Cool colors recede. So cool colors should be in the background. Warm colors should be on your foreground object. In this case, the figure. So by that reasoning, you should be wearing, red or maybe a warm reddish brown garment or something like that would seem to advance. And the background should be, cool blues and greens. But Gainsborough decided he's going to break the rules. He'll say, don't tell me how to paint. I'm going to break the rules. And so what he does is he puts his figure in a blue costume, which should recede, but he makes it lighter than the background. And remember, light colors advance. And then he has this warm brownish background. And he makes it darker in places. So it seems to recede. So you have the light blue coming forward, advancing, and the warm browns of the background receding. And the figure looks perfectly three-dimensional, stands out perfectly well. In other words, he breaks the rules, shows you can do it, and it works. Line and brushstroke. Now, we often divide paintings into two categories. These were actually established by a German art historian named Heinrich Wölfflin around the turn of the 20th century, around 1900. He lived in late 19th and into the early 20th century. And he wrote a book called The Principles of Art. And in it, he had a list of stylistic categories that were sort of in opposition. And among these was the word linear and the word that we have translated as painterly. He was German. He was writing in German. And the word that he used to describe paintings with loose brushwork would have translated literally as picturesque. He kind of made up a word. Germans can do that. And so it didn't work to translate it literally. So we had to make up, in English, they had to make up another term. And the term was painterly, like a painting, as it were. So sometimes you have artwork, and here we're thinking of paintings, but it could also be drawings or prints that have very clear edges. There's a clear distinction between, say, the background and maybe the object. And also, there are many artists who paint with lines. They first create their image with line, and then they add color. So oftentimes that line is, part of the image, and it defines the contour of the forms. And so this is what we call linear art, with very clear edges, and especially when they are using line. The opposite of that is painterly, where you have loose brushwork, or sometimes diffuse or obscure contours, obscure edges. Maybe you can't quite tell where one part ends and another begins, or it's in shadow, perhaps, or it's loosely painted. So let me give you some examples. This is an artist we'll be talking about in class again, although not this particular work of art. This is a Madonna and Child, Mary and the Baby Jesus, by Botticelli. From the late 15th century, and this one happens to be in the United States. It's in the Fogg Museum, Cambridge. And if you look closely at it, you'll see there seem to be lines around everything. There's lines around the faces, there's lines around the bodies, the nose, the mouth, the fingers, if you could see clearly, the fingernails. Everything is defined in terms of line. And Botticelli is very, very well known for his linear style. It's very, very graceful, very, very beautiful, curving lines. And so he's a perfect example of a linear artist. But here's the opposite. This is painterly. And my example here is a detail, so when you're going close in, whenever I can, I like to show details because it gives you a better example of what the painting surface actually looks like. And this is from one of Rembrandt's many self-portraits. And so, as you see, we're sort of honing in on the face. That's what a detail means. You're looking closely at one part. And as you can see, we can actually see the brush strokes. We can see the texture of how he laid down the brushes. Look at the cap that he's wearing. You can look at this and you can say, okay, I can see that he used a flat brush. And, he drew that flat brush across loaded with paint across this surface. And we can still see the mark of the brush, as it were. Also, if you look at the face, so where exactly does the chin and the neck, are they distinguished? Say some of the edges of the face and the hair or one part from another. There's some very dark shadows here that make it a little bit, obscure. It's not like Botticelli where you can see every single thing clearly and there's a line around it. In this case, the figure is created with loose or free brushstrokes that build up the form. And in this case, the artist has left those brushstrokes for us to see. And sort of like the activity of the artist, that we can still communicate with that. We can still get an idea of his physical activity, what he was doing. Okay, we've talked about color, line and brushstroke, and now we want to talk about shape. Now, line and shape can have direction and movement. I'm not necessarily talking about, physical movement, although there are works of art that are kinetic, that do move, say mobiles, for example. But implied movement, if you will, or if you want to call it psychological movement, I guess you could do that too. Some forms seem to be, some shapes seem to be more horizontal, vertical, diagonal, curving, or angular. So let's look at some examples and let's see how the artist can use that and what's implied, what emotional or psychological state is implied by these different shapes or different directions of either line or shape. For example, horizontal. Something that's stretched out. Seems to be peaceful, serene, relaxing. You're lying down to sleep. You're stretching out to rest. And so what I'm giving you here is an example by a 17th century artist named Vermeer. It's a view of his home city, his view of Delft in the Netherlands. And if you look at the different shapes in it, the buildings, there you have a strong band, almost a horizontal band of the buildings on the side of this water. And then if you look even closer, you're seeing, say, the roof line, you're seeing this wall, you're seeing the edge of the quay, you can see a bridge just off-center a little bit to the right. And these are all horizontal forms. You have a little bit of a kind of curving diagonal in the foreground, but it's pretty much horizontal until it tapers off a little bit. And then if you look at the clouds are about 2/3 of the painting. And there is an artist of the same period of the 17th century named Ruysdael who brings clouds billowing in on diagonals. But that's not what's going on here. The clouds are actually floating around in our horizontals. You want to have a line from one side of the picture to another that describes them as sort of horizontal, paralleling the shape of the town and the buildings. And of course, if everything were horizontal, it'd be really boring, wouldn't it? So of course, the clouds are not, I say a rectangle. They're amorphous in shape. They're just longer. And you have a lot of small vertical elements, towers, edges of buildings, for example. Now, I'm going to tell you something about this serene, peaceful, relaxing view of Delft. If you look at the space right over the bridge, as it were, it looks a little bit empty. Well, there was a reason for that. They had an armory there, and one time the armory, filled with gunpowder, blew up. And, of course, it took out the houses that were around it, and it left a great crater in the ground. And this painting was painted after it, and it has been suggested that Vermeer was doing it as, sort of good propaganda for his city. He wants it to look safe, serene, relaxing, like that never ever happened or isn't going to happen again. And interestingly enough, that bridge, which is, as I say, before the place where the armory once stood, is actually shorter. So he's extended it and made it more horizontal, more calming, as it were, right at the place where the disaster happened. Incidentally, they rebuilt the armory and it blew up again. So it's not quite as safe as you might think from looking at this picture. Okay, the opposite is vertical, things that go upwards. And we often do associate Gothic architecture, and this is a 13th century French church, and it's actually the side aisle of Reims Cathedral, which means it's lower than the main point. But as you can see, it still exemplifies verticality. You have all of these little colonnettes that are attached to the larger column, and they're rising upward. They seem to be thin and tall. And then you have pointed arches that, once again, are pointing upwards. It's a little hard here to see the windows, but the windows also are pointed. And so what you're having is this feeling of reaching upward. Now, many human religions do have this feeling of reaching upward associated with spirituality. You can see it in the Gothic cathedral, of course. If you think of ancient Sumerian religions, where you have ziggurats, essentially artificial mountains, or step pyramids. They shape like a pyramid, but they're in steps that go upward. And the shrine to the god is at the highest point. The Olympian deities live on the mountain, or on Mount Olympus. The psalmist says, I shall lift my eyes to the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. So, this idea of looking up, and of course we think about sky deities and sun gods, and you look up and there is Ra, or Horus, or Aton, if you're, or Ammon. And, all of these ideas of looking up, representing spirituality, seem to be pretty ingrained in human beings. So sometimes that's what verticality implies, as in the Gothic church. And here's another example. This is by El Greco. It's as seen from the book of Revelation, or the Apocalypse, which is supposed to be a vision of St. John. And it's the opening of the fifth seal with the saints receiving like more gold, but they're white robes, is what the Bible says. And you can see these people are all sort of elongated. They're stretched out. They have small heads in proportion to their bodies. And El Greco, of course, is famous for painting his very elongated and very painterly, as you can see, figures, paintings. But in this case, it is a religious subject, so, it is enhancing that idea of spirituality. Now, verticality doesn't always mean spirituality. For example, this is a mid-16th century portrait by Bronzino. And you can see that this man, very, very elegant. He has these long, tapering fingers. He's standing up very, very straight. And he is also slightly elongated, which was a characteristic of the Mannerist period of the 16th century. Not only imaginary figures, would be portrayed this way, but aristocrats like to show themselves as very elegant. And you can also think of things like fashion models or fashion drawings as being very elongated to look chic and elegant. So, verticality, once again. Okay. Here we're neither spiritual nor chic and elegant, even though we do have, as you can see, a Gothic pointed window behind us. This painting is an American painting from the 20th century. It's by a regional artist whose name is Grant Wood. And it's one of those, very, very famous paintings that you see reproduced and sometimes spoofed a bit. It's called American Gothic. And we pointed out that the house has a pointed arch behind it, divided into two pointed sections. Even the clapboard on the building, is running vertically, which usually you think of building. Usually you think of the clapboard on buildings just running horizontally. So here it's running vertically. You have that great point of the gable. And then the people are elongated. They're kind of all stretched out. And the man is holding a pitchfork, once again, three vertical elements. You can almost call them lines, very thin shapes. The way his garment is placed, he's got the coat coming down in verticals on either side, and then the seam in the middle, another vertical. They're also very compressed. And that combination, they're vertical, but they're also compressed together. There's not a lot of open space. So how does that make you feel? When I'm in class, I ask students, come on, throw out adjectives at me. What do you think these people are like? How would you describe them? And, we get words like dour and stern and repressed and, all sorts of things that people would call them. I say, do you think they're going to be the life of your next party? No, of course not. But a couple of words that you might also think of them is they seem to be good, upright people. And there's that pun on the word vertical is upright. So he's playing, I guess, a little bit visually, verbally, with this idea of verticality in a very different way than the works that we just saw. Artists are free to take elements and, create something a little bit different than other people. In fact, we want them to do that. Diagonal. Diagonal implies action, drama, movement. This was a while back, so you probably don't remember it, but there used to be an advertisement for an automobile in which, the car would go around, and it ended up in a garage that was shaped like an acute angle, like with a diagonal roof. And the tagline was, "Triumph, the shape of things to come." And of course, driving right into that triangular garage, it was implying speed, movement, going forward. And that's what a diagonal does. it implies action. And here I have two examples. One, it's kind of the action looks a bit frozen, and the other, the diagonal is somewhat spatial. The one is from a 5th century BC Greek relief, and it's the battle of the Greeks and the Amazons. And as you can see in the battle scenes, people are on the diagonal. You have this one group of the two Greeks threatening the Amazon, and they may create a equilateral triangle because the men are leaning in and the woman is another sort of triangle below them. That's why I say it looks frozen, because they're so equalized that we have that idea of the action, all of these diagonals and the legs and the stance and the raised arms, and yet they're so completely balanced that they almost seem to be frozen in their action. On the other side, you have the man, the warrior, pulling the Amazon from her horse. And, of course, he's leaning back, and she's being pulled back, and then the horse is going the other direction, is rearing up. So once again, you have this feeling of action, something implied by the diagonal. And if you think whenever you move, you've got to throw yourself off a perfect vertical form. And, and you do... perhaps if you're running, maybe on a bit of a diagonal. The other work of art is from the 16th century, late 16th century, by an artist named Tintoretto. And he has exaggerated the perspective. He has exaggerated these architectural moldings and what are supposed to be wall tombs. They're reaching back into space, and it just seems to, to zoom back into space with this diagonal movement. And you also see this figure in the foreground, in the left foreground, with the raised arm, raised up diagonally. Okay, what's going on here? This actually is the finding of the body of Saint Mark, the discovery of the body of Saint Mark. Some of you know that the patron saint of Venice is Saint Mark, and the Cathedral of Venice is San Marco. And this is essentially showing how they got their relic, which is supposed to be the body of Saint Mark, which is in the cathedral, I believe, under the altar. He was supposed to be buried in Alexander, so they went to Alexandria and found the body. Well, there's lots of bodies. How do we know which one's Mark's? So they're pulling these bodies out of the tombs up there on the wall. Probably didn't really look like this, but this is, centuries and centuries later, imaginary. And St. Mark comes down from heaven. He's the figure in the foreground with the raised arm, and you can see a little glow of light, his halo around his head, and it's like he's saying, "Stop! You found me! Take me back to Venice." So it's obviously a little spot of what we might call holy grave robbing that is being approved of by the saint himself. So are we talking about a lot of movement here, like a battle scene? No, we're talking about drama. And all of those dramatic gesture of the raised hand and the dramatic diagonals of the perspective, seem to zoom back into space. People taking bodies out of tombs, well, this makes it dramatic. This makes it exciting. It elevates it, in a sense, to something besides grubby grave robbing. Okay, curving lines. Curving lines, we feel, are innately graceful. And for your example, I brought you in two female figures. One is by a mid-20th century British artist, Henry Moore. And he would often use these abstract forms of female figures. And of course, the curving lines are implying, femininity and gracefulness. And of course, there's a long tradition of that. And here is an early 16th century example, about 1510, by Giorgione, probably finished by his friend Titian after Giorgione died in 1510, known as the Sleeping Venus. So the goddess Venus sleeping in the landscape. And as you can see, we have these very graceful curves, very gentle. curves here that define the female form and are also, in some cases, repeated in the curve of the landscape and a little bit in the clouds and this winding road and the hillock behind her. So that idea of grace is implied in the curving forms and curving shapes and lines. Now, curving forms can also be very energetic. For example, and I'm bringing you something very, very old. Some of you may remember this from the Art History 1 class if you took it. It's a Minoan landscape. It's sometimes been called the earliest landscape that still survives. What you're looking at is predominantly a reconstruction because this is a fresco. It's pieces of colored plaster that actually had to be picked up and put together like a jigsaw puzzle with many pieces missing to create this. But we're not going to worry about that. What we're going to look at is all the curving shapes and the curving lines. And these are, the hills of Crete or Thera, the islands around Greece. The Minoan culture was based on Crete. And this particular one is on one of the other islands, Thera. But you can see that the landscape, it's almost undulating. The forms curve in, they curve out, and then you have these little birds and plants, coming from them. When someone talks about the sound, the idea of the hills are alive with the sound of music, I'm more apt to think of this than I am the Alps, actually, because it does almost seem like the hills are dancing there with all of these wonderful, energetic, curving lines. And here's another example, and this one from closer to 1500 CE or AD, actually probably around 1482. This is Botticelli's Primavera. The title means spring. And you have classical deities in a landscape. We'll discuss this painting later in more detail in class. What I want you to notice here is all of these shapes and lines that are just, curving forms. And Botticelli's known for that. And if you look at them, they almost seem to be forming a little dance, a very staid dance, not, today's dancing, but almost like when you would dip down and come up. And so you have Zephyr, that's the blue guy, on the far right, and he's leaning out, he's grasping Chloris, and someone says go down, and then her arm leads you up. The figure next to her, his arms leading down and then up. The draperies and the gesture of Venus, the female figure in the center, down, and then the hand, this welcoming hand leading you up. The three graces are dancing in a ring. And as you can see, the hands are raised, you can always imagine them, going around in a circle and maybe dipping up and down. And then our eye goes down and, it comes up with the Mercury's hand. We follow that up and we follow his arm upward. So there is this rhythmic movement implied by the shapes and the myriad of curving lines. And it seems very, very graceful, but also, an energy about it. As I said, it's almost like a dance on the surface. And here are some details so you can see a little more clearly. Okay, besides curving forms, we have to have geometric shapes. Now, obviously things like arcs and circles, kind of have both curving forms and more cubic shapes as can be fitted within the idea of geometric shapes. And what I picked to illustrate that was a tomb statue of a pharaoh from the Middle Kingdom in Egypt. And you can see the block from which this was carved, it's very much a rectangular form. The figure itself seems to be very blocky. Many of the shapes, like the legs and the feet and the shoulders with the arm crossed over the torso almost seem to be rectangular with sort of curved edges. And then, of course, the crown of Egypt is various shapes on a conic or a cylindrical shape. And it's very symmetrical. It's just very rigid in shape. And it does seem to imply a stability or a permanence. These were used in tombs for what we might call the soul of the deceased. There were believed to be different parts of the soul, and one was called the ka. And the ka, if he didn't have a place to rest, would have to wander the earth. So they tried to preserve the body, but what happens if something happens to the body? He could also use something like the tomb statue of the deceased, in this case, the king or the pharaoh. And so they wanted this to imply, eternity, stability, permanence. It was to help the pharaoh live forever, that his spirit would continue on. And that seemed to be implied. Now, not all geometric shapes are going to seem to be, stable and permanent. You also have angular forms, forms that are, like acute angles of, say, a triangle. This is Picasso's Weeping Women from the 20th century. And the figure seems to be broken up into all of these angular forms. If you think about how you feel when you're suffering or when you're upset, when you're going through a lot of pain or, emotional trauma, you may feel like you're coming apart. And he visualizes that. So when you look at this, it may even give you a better feeling of suffering and pain and agony than a very realistic image of, we're looking out at someone crying. She's literally coming apart. And you can see that the parts of the face, have angular forms. That, they're almost like there's daggers stabbing at you. It does seem to imply suffering and agony and pain. You'll also notice that he's using complementary hues, red and green, yellow green, a little deeper green in some places, which of course, we said fight with each other. They set up this contrast and tension, which, increases this feeling of agony. Okay, our fourth visual element of space. Now, when we talk about space in works of art, sometimes we're actually talking about actual physical space. A sculpture, which is three-dimensional, architecture, which is three-dimensional with spaces that you can walk into. And then sometimes we're talking about illusionistic space, works of art that create the illusion that even though you have a flat surface, say a canvas or a piece of wood or a wall or a piece of paper, that's flat. But the image on it looks as though it's three-dimensional. And I have here two ways that you can create that illusion. One is called atmospheric perspective. Another is called linear perspective. Perspective means that you are showing the illusion of depth, and it's a way to do that. And we'll come and talk about those in a minute. But first I want to talk about actual space. Now, when you're creating a work of art that is sculptural, it's three-dimensional. And sometimes it's, extends out from a surface. That's called relief sculpture. Or sometimes, you can see it, fully on all sides, perhaps. And it's what we would call sculpture in the round. And so this is a sculpture that you could literally walk around and see it from all different angles, that we're just looking at the photograph from one point of view. It is a 17th century statue in marble of David as he's battling the giant Goliath. And it's by the undoubtedly one of the most important artists of the 17th century, Bernini. Now, Bernini had a way of creating a link between the viewer and his works of art. And here you see David is in action. And you can see all those diagonals that make you feel, diagonal movement. And he's pulled back his arm. He's holding a sling. He's got the rock in the sling. And he's going to let it fly. Now, what I want you to do is imagine you're standing in front of this picture, the statue. There is the space that is occupied by the actual marble statue. But with Bernini, there's almost a kind of, I call it charged space, a relationship between the viewer and the statue, because it's almost as though he could let that rock fly and it would come into your space. So he's breaking down that illusion that this is just art. You're supposed to react and interact. And so the space between the statue and the viewer actually, has some meaning, as well as the physical space of the statue. Now, another type of space, of course, would be architecture. This is space that you can actually walk into, that you can actually experience around you and above you. And I'm going to show you here two different examples of religious architecture. One is a model of the hypostyle hall at Karnak in ancient Egypt. It's now, of course, somewhat in ruin. Some of it still survives, but you can get a better idea when you look at this little model. And you can see that there are these huge pillars. Hypostyle, we refer to this as there's a forest of columns, a forest of pillars. And so they're very, very thick. A human being may be extremely tiny in this space. Now, how does that make you feel? Okay, imagine, let's say you're an Egyptian priest, because not anybody could walk into the temple. The ceremonies would begin outside in a large open area. And in fact, they would process from about 3 miles away from Luxor to Karnak. So you're out in the desert sun, as it were, open spaces. And then you come to the temple. And you enter into this hall. And from this big expansive space of the outside, you're in a forest of columns. And these are huge columns. They dwarf you. And they're very set close together, as you can see. How do you feel? You might feel small and insignificant. And actually, the way the temples are arranged is the rooms then become smaller, and the room in which the statue of the god would be placed might be, much smaller. So it's almost like you're being compressed, into humility as you get closer and closer to the statue of the deity, as you approach the god, as it were. That's a very different religious experience than what you might experience in a Gothic cathedral. Now, this is an early Gothic cathedral. This is Lyon Cathedral. It's a late 12th century. And it's in France. And it has some of these vertical elements. It's not as vertical as you'll get later on, but the vertical elements of the colonnettes rising up, of the pointed arches, and these large spaces, between the columns and, across the central hallway, which we call a nave. And then, of course, you have colored light coming in through these stained glass windows. And once it would have been painted brightly, just as the temple at Karnak would have been painted brightly. So all those things are part of the both aesthetic and religious experience. And literally, the patron of the first Gothic structure, which is Abbot Suger at Saint-Denis, then outside of Paris, now within Paris. He wrote about the experience of a Gothic church, and it's very expansive. It's actually much smaller than the hypostyle hall at Karnak, but because the spaces are more open, because it seems to be soaring upward. You have this feeling of, what Suger says is your soul rises in an anagogical manner. It's kind of a mystical experience. And that's a very different religious experience. But it is, at least in part, engendered by the architecture. The architecture is leading you into certain emotions that are considered to be appropriate for the religious experience of these, two different religions. That was architecture and sculpture, real space, something that's actually three-dimensional. A lot of art, think of paintings, a lot of art creates the illusion that they are three-dimensional. The illusion of space or solidity or depth on a flat surface. In this case, we're looking at a work of art by an anonymous artist from the 15th century. We can identify a number of works by him. We don't know his name. Nothing is signed. There's no documents that tell us what his name is. So we call him the master of the legend of St. Lucy, or just the Lucy Master, after one of his works of art. Obviously not this one. This one's in Minneapolis. It's a lamentation over the body of Christ. And I brought it in because it illustrates a number of ways to create the illusion of three-dimensionality. And here are some of those ways. Overlapping. Now, we see in the center Mary, holding her dead son, Christ, on her lap. And behind her is standing St. John. He's the figure with the yellow garment. We say that, Christ is on Mary's lap, even though we know this is it's a flat piece of wood, essentially, that's been painted. Because we can see her knees, and most of the body seems to be where we visually would interpret her lap to be. And then there's John, and we'd say he's behind her. Now, the painter didn't paint the entire figure of St. John, and then paint the entire figure of Mary, and then paint the entire figure of Christ on top, each one on top of the other. He knew that the illusion would be created. He just painted the part that we see of John, and the part of Mary. Her underneath Christ is not painted blue for Mary's garment. He would have stopped and painted Christ there. So we have this overlapping of the figures. They appear to overlap because they abut each other, and we interpret them as continuing on beneath the other figure. Okay, overlapping. That's a good way to suggest that there's some depth, that one figure is behind another. Another is different sizes. When something's large, we think of it as being closer to us. So here we have these people in the foreground, and they're pretty big compared to the background. Look in the background. There's this whole city. Of course, it's supposed to be Jerusalem, but it actually is a city portrait of Bruges in Flanders. This happens in a number of paintings by the Lucy Master, so we know he came from Bruges. And you see various towers. There's the Beffroi, as it was being built at the time, and the tower that's closest to the crosses is the tower of the Church of Our Lady. But wait a minute, those are huge towers, and these are walled cities. None of these people could fit in that. The people are much larger than the buildings. And then you've got mountains, and the people are much larger than mountains. Well, this doesn't make any sense, or does it? It makes sense visually. Because we know that when something's close to us, even if it's smaller, it's going to look larger. So a person who's standing close to us looks much larger than that distant city, or those distant trees and mountains, which look smaller. They're smaller as they get further and further away. So size suggests to us that these objects and figures are in 3 dimensions, that they're actually existing in space. And then there's shading. Now, we talked about that, chiaroscuro, when you're modeling in light and dark. And once again, you look at any of these figures, say, look at the figure of Christ. There's dark shadows, there's medium tones, and there's highlights. And that makes the figure seem to be solid and 3-dimensional. And here's a term I promised to explain to you: atmospheric perspective. It's also called aerial perspective because it has to do with the atmosphere or the air. And, our region's a perfect place to look at them. If you're driving down the Blue Ridge Parkway, why do they call it the Blue Ridge Parkway? Because as you see these mountains in the distance, there's air or atmosphere between your eyes and the distant mountains, and sometimes, depending on the atmospheric conditions, it gives them a kind of bluish haze, sometimes a grayish haze. But so it seems to be blue. And then, of course, if you get closer, it may take on the actual colors of, say, the trees. Say it's fall, and then we start to see beautiful colored trees as the leaves are turning. And if you get out of your car and you walk right up, you can see the individual shapes of those trees. So we have this blueness, but we also have this haziness, something that's far away from us. Like those mountains, they look hazy. They've got softer edges. And something that's really close to us, that's really clear, has harder edges, as you can see in the picture. And, when you get really close, as I said, you get really close to that tree, you can see every vein in the leaf. But you can't see it from a distance. It just looks sort of hazy. So that hazy and often that bluish tone that, for example, distant mountains take, that's called atmospheric perspective. So if something gets hazier and bluer in the background, we're seeing atmospheric perspective. And then the foreground, and I know I don't have any details to show you of this, but if you were looking at the details of the figure, there's plants. This is actually a characteristic of the Lucy Master. He has lines of strawberries and leaves, and you can see the lines of them. They're very clearly painted. They're not atmospheric at all in the foreground. I think when most people say perspective, though, they're usually thinking of linear perspective. Now, linear perspective, and we'll be talking more about this, of course, later on, was actually invented or discovered, depending on whether you think of it as a natural phenomena or a mathematical concoction, I guess, but in the early 15th century by an artist named Brunelleschi. And then it was developed. And he noticed that if you have straight lines and you extend them, they will appear to meet at a focal point, which we today call a vanishing point. And there's two kinds of linear perspective. There's one-point perspective, which you see here, this example, which of course Brunelleschi would never have used, but it looks like a highway, maybe through the American Southwest, someplace it's absolutely flat. And we know that the highways do not taper off to nothing. That you have to have parallel sides of the highway to accommodate the cars. But if you look into the far, far distance right on the horizon, it appears that the two sides of the highway are meeting at a single point. And also, these trees, which are presumably the same size, seem to get smaller and smaller proportionately. It's all worked out by mathematics. and look down at the bottom and you see this grid. The way a lot of artists in the 15th century learned to do linear perspective was a book that was written called translated it would be About Painting or On Painting. And it was by an architect and humanist scholar named Alberti. And this is, how he described creating the perspective that was discovered or invented by Brunelleschi. And you can see that you have lines that are oblique to the picture surface. They are not parallel. They, extend out, seem to meet at a single vanishing point. And then, and once again, you're working it all out with your mathematical and geometric constructions. These shapes, this little grid, the lines that are parallel to the picture plane seem to get closer and closer together as they go back into space. One of the things that you will notice, and when you take your quiz, notice this, that in the 15th century, when they first started doing linear perspective, a lot of times they'd create these grids and then they'd use them as the tiles or the inlaid marbles on the floor of the building that they are showing in their picture. I'll show you an example in a moment. There's another kind of linear perspective that was invented by, or discovered by Brunelleschi that's called two-point perspective. And this is when you're showing something, let's say the edge of a building is pointing out at you. You see this rectangle, this cube here. And so each side is going back to a single vanishing point. Now, the vanishing points don't even have to be within the picture. You could cut this off and have the vanishing points be somewhere outside the picture. But it is called either linear, because you're using all these lines to create it, or mathematical perspective. And here's some examples. On the left, I have a 16th century, early 16th century woodcut of the Nativity by Albrecht Dürer. And you can see that there's a lot of straight lines that are oblique to the picture plane. You have the edge of the plinths. You have the joints of the threshold. You have these rafters in the ruined stable. And they all, as you can see, if you extend those lines, meet at a single vanishing point. And though over here on the right, we have a painting of the Annunciation from the 15th century in Italy. And you'll notice the grid on the floor that I mentioned. And then even the walls. This artist wants to show you that he knows how to do linear perspective. He's put coffered ceiling, the lines in the ceiling, lines on the walls, and they all go back to a vanishing point in the landscape outside the window, not centered here. And then he puts his figures in the foreground, so I guess he doesn't have to deal too much with the relative size. But of course, this subject has mainly two figures in it, Mary and the angel telling her that she will bear the Christ child. But that gives you an idea what I talked about, is once you've done all that work to create the grid, many of the artists wanted to use it. And here's another example. This is from the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican. On the walls, you have scenes from the life of Christ and some of the scenes from the figures of the what the Christians call the Old Testament, the stories of Moses, for example. And this is by the artist Perugino. And it's Christ giving Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven, which is essentially a analogy or a statement that Christ names. He says, "You are Peter, upon this rock I will build my church." The word Petrus in Latin also means rock. And I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And that is the verse that the bishops of Rome, the popes, say give them their papal authority and primacy, because Peter became the first bishop of Rome. Well, at any rate, this is shown here very literally, in a sense, with Christ actually handing keys to Peter, right here in the center foreground. And then, as you can see, the background looks like it's taking place in Rome. Jesus was never in Rome, but with these very classical buildings. Some of them look like triumphal arches. They are actually based on Roman triumphal arches, and a octagonal domed building in the center. But you can see, once again, the grid that's on the stones of the piazza, and how the people are proportionally small. These people are further back in space, so they're smaller. The people who are foreground are larger. And you have your diagram showing that Perugino has figured out the linear perspective for this. Now, paintings do not always have to have linear perspective to look three-dimensional. This is a convention that has been used since the early 15th century. And in the 15th century, some people used it, some people didn't. It essentially spread from Florence, where it was invented, to the rest of Italy, and then eventually in the second half of the 15th century, some artists started using it in Northern Europe. But it is a convention. So let me show you before linear perspective. Now, this is a fresco, a painting on the wall, from Pompeii. And as you know, Pompeii is a Roman city that was covered up by volcanic ash in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, and then was excavated starting in the 18th century. So this is one of the paintings on the wall, and it's not in perfect condition, as you can see. It's painted very freely too, but I think you can make out the fact that you have different buildings here. The Romans, as far as we know, never used linear perspective. There's some discussion about whether they knew the mathematical principles, but we have no pictures that have survived showing linear perspective from Roman times. And moreover, we have no authors talking about it. Not necessarily those words, but just describing it, which makes us think that the artist did not use it. And here, of course, they aren't. The buildings look three-dimensional. They're shaded. We can see pillars and doorways and roofs, but they're from all different points of view. For example, the building here on one of it's kind of ruined off to the left, but you can see a doorway and some corbels underneath the possibly the roof line. And the doorway, it looks like here, it looks like we're looking up into the door and up to the cornice, and you can see shading. And the other building, seems to the edge of it is pointing out to us, the corner of it, but the two sides go back at very different angles. It's not an organized two-point perspective there. And then the building on the right, we're looking down on. We're looking down on the roof, as it were, rather than up. They all look pretty much three-dimensional, but they do not follow the conventions of linear perspective. Now, that's nothing wrong with that. And that's one of the things I often have to teach students, because I'll have students say, well, they didn't do it right, or, it's wrong that they didn't use linear perspective. I said, why do you say that? Because at certain times, artists used linear perspective. At other times, they didn't. But I just wanted to show you sort of the difference. Okay, we're still talking about illusionistic space that isn't really there. It's on a wall or a paper or a canvas or a wood. And here's two examples, one from art history from the 16th century, and the other probably familiar to you from popular culture. Both are to illustrate foreshortening. Foreshortening. Now, foreshortening, I'm going to define as the perceived distortion. It's not really distorted, it just looks that way. So the perceived distortion of an object that is oblique to the picture surface. Oblique meaning that it is not parallel to the picture surface. So, okay, let's take Uncle Sam first. Uncle Sam from the World War II recruiting posters is pointing out at you, and he's saying, "I want you." And his finger is coming straight out at us. Except, if you really think about it, it looks like, what is it, short and stubby? His arm looks kind of shortened. That's what we call foreshortening. That's what it looks like when something is coming straight out at you. Imagine, someone's got his hand out straight at you, and the other arm, in fact, you can use this, Jason, I've been showing it. The other arm is parallel to the body, or to the picture plane, if it's a picture. Well, that hand that's extending straight out looks larger than the hand that's parallel. And also the arm is going to look, shorter and stubbier. The arm's okay. It's not harmed. It's just the way that we see it. So here we have Hans Baldung, who is a German 16th century artist, and he's created this print of the groom bewitched. He does a lot of witchcraft scenes. And so you have the witch who with a flaming torch leaning in the window, and the groom has fallen, passed out, insensible, but his feet are extending right out toward us, like great big feet, great big soles of his shoes. And as we look back, his torso is shorter, and his head, seems to be squished in there. Well, we understand what's going on here. We don't think that his body suddenly got squished. We read it as it's foreshortened. The legs are extending toward us, so the feet look large in relationship to the head, and, the various body parts seem to be shortened, pushed closer together. You can also see this with the horse. And one of the things they loved to do in the Renaissance was show horses from the rear because it could show off their skill at foreshortening. So you have the horse's rear pointed out toward us. And then, we know that a horse's body is longer than that. But we also know that if we see the horse from the rear, the torso of the horse, the rib cage, the body of the horse is going to look shorter. So this is foreshortened. And the fifth and final visual element that I want to talk about is texture. And this will also include any pattern. Texture is a visual element that appeals to the sense of touch. And it often has to do with how light reflects off different surfaces. Just think about it for a minute. If you had various substances laid out in front of you, and one of them was sandpaper, and another was a piece of satin, you might not have to touch the sandpaper or touch the satin to know what they would feel like. Probably because you've done it before, but also because you're looking at the way light reflects off the sandpaper and the way the light reflects off the satin and judging how it would feel. So if an artist wanted to create the illusion of that texture, they would imitate the way light would reflect from different surfaces. But first, let's talk about actual texture. For example, sculpture. We have here an alabaster sculpture by the artist Auguste Rodin. It's from the Greek myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. This is created, though, in the late 19th century. And, the story, of course, is Orpheus goes down into Hades to rescue his dead wife, Eurydice. And he's the greatest musician, so he plays his music. And even Hades, or Pluto, once Hades is the Greek name, Pluto is the Roman name, even he, has his heart softened, the ruler of the underworld has his heart softened by the beautiful music. So he agrees to let Eurydice come back to life if Orpheus can fulfill a seemingly simple task. He says, you go back up through the cave of the underworld where he entered the underworld, and Eurydice will follow you. And do not turn around until you are both out of the cave. Seems simple. Except Orpheus keeps wondering, is she really there? Was I tricked? Whatever. And he's so anxious to see her that he steps out of the cave and turns around. And Eurydice is still within the mouth of the cave, and he loses her forever. So this is, before, they're just still in the cave, in the entrance of the cave, and Orpheus has not yet stepped forth. He's covering his eyes. It's made out of alabaster, which is somewhat translucent stone. So the figures are polished, and somewhat light can sink into them as well as reflect off of them. But what the artist has done is to give you that stony feeling. He's left the stone with some of the marks of the tools, some of the marks of the stone, without polishing it up, and it's giving you that feeling of actual texture of the stone to contrast with the polish of the figures. So this is what the actual texture of the stone is. No one's painted this to look like it. On the other hand, you have, and this is just a tiny little detail from a painting by Jackson Pollock. It's called One, and he is the artist who does a lot of drip paintings or action paintings where he throws and drips paint on these, huge canvases. So, you see a little reproduction and you can, barely make it out. But if you look at it very closely, when you're looking at the actual work, you see all of these different textures, which are the actual texture of the paint. Some places where it's dripped, some places where it's very thick, some places where it may be so thin that you can see this canvas beneath it. And all of these different shapes and textures of the paint itself. So that's the actual texture of the paint. Now, there are other artists who create the illusion of textures from the natural world. They're imitating the surfaces and the way light shines on those different surfaces. When someone creates a work of art that makes you think it's real, and often with the texture being a strong element of that, it's the space and the shapes and of course the texture. But we do call that by a French term, trompe l'œil, or fool the eye. The artist trying to fool you into believing that the objects that he painted are actually real. Now, no artist imitated texture better than Jan van Eyck. This is a detail from a painting by Jan van Eyck showing the Virgin Mary. And just look at all of the different textures that he's created. The softness of the hair, the light shining off the jewels, brocade in the background, plants, flowers, the lily and the rose that seem to grow from her crown. And, as I say, Jan van Eyck was the master of showing illusionistic texture.